Hi, I'm Keith Fludder. I'm a bladesmith, and what we're going to talk about today is some mosaic Damascus. Basically, making mosaic Damascus is fairly straightforward. It really depends on how you stack your billet up in the first instance. For an example, if I was going to do like a raindrop pattern or maidenhair or a ladder pattern, it's just two different types of steel that I layer up alternately. With making mosaics, you can change out how you, or change up how you actually stack your billet in the first place. So what we're going to talk about here is just an explosion pattern, which is based on W's. But what I actually want is I want a larger, darker area in the center of my mosaic pattern. And so how I do that is, and what I'm using here is 1084 and 15N20, which is pretty standard sort of a mix. So what I do, and I'm using 3mm stock usually, right? So what I actually do is I will start my billet off by having 5 pieces of 1084. Then I'm going to have 3 pieces of 15N20. Then I will stack this up and have another 3 pieces of 1084. Then basically I'm going to just go alternately with the 1084 and the 15N20. And usually I'll finish out the billet with 1084 on the outside. It just seems to stick together a little bit better. So that's how I've stacked my billet up. And so what I do is I will compress it this way under my power hammer or my press, and then make that into one piece. So you see that it's oriented this way. So I will stack that back up so that it is in this vertical position, and basically I make a long bar out of that. Because what I want to do first of all is I want to make W's. Yep. So I stretch that out, and then what I do is I'll cut that into 4 or 5 pieces, depending upon if I want a finer pattern, I'll cut it into 5 or 6 pieces, or if I want a broader pattern, I'll cut it up into 4 pieces, whatever the case may be. So once I've got that bar and I've cut it up, what I actually do is I will stack it up on top of one another, as long as I maintain that these positions are going to be the same in my stack. Does that make sense? I hope so. So that I've got all of this dark colour sitting on top of themselves.
No, I don't get that, Keith.
Okay, sorry. So basically, I've got my flat bar. I've got my flat bar, and here I have got that. Yep. So what I do is I make sure when I cut it up in my bandsaw. So this is just a flat bar, right? So what I do is I'll clean this surface up, both sides, and then what I do is I'll draw a line, just with a marking pen, and so that when I stack them up, I'll make sure that that black line is on the top. that means that when I orientate this, that all of this dark is actually sitting on top of each other. And so is all of the rest of this, right? So once I've done that, I'll take another weld on that. And again, I'll repeat that same process again. I might do that 3 times. So basically what happens is that when you're making a W, there's 2 different ways to make it. Basically, once I have taken my initial weld, being this way, I can then actually turn it over and I can compress. If you have, here's our bar that we've just welded up together. So what I can do is I can actually turn it on its bias. Yeah. And I can re-square that. So what that actually does is deforms the pattern like this. So it's more like an S than a W. I prefer to use this method here by stacking it up on top of itself maybe 3-4 times, depends on the thickness of the pattern. What actually happens when you restack this a number of times, it will actually turn out to be a lot sharper, and therefore you get your W's. Hopefully we've all got that. I'm going to just rub all of this off now so that we can go to the next piece. So what I do is when I'm making mosaics, I will actually draw on my board here exactly the process of what we're talking about. So I've got my initial stack, yep. I make a bar out of that, as I've just explained. Restack. And just for argument's sake, we're going to say I'm going to restack 4 times into a square. Yep. So now I've got a square, and it's probably, depending upon the amount of material that you start out with, it's going to be around about that length. Yep. So what I do then, because I'm making an explosion pattern, which is a 4-way. This is a 4-way. So each one of these is going to be in here. What I then do, because it's an explosion pattern, I'm actually going to put it back on its bias and compress this and re-square. So I've re-squared. That becomes one element. So what I'll do at that particular stage, I'll obviously cut it up into 4 pieces. What I'll do is I'll etch the end of those 4 pieces so that I can see which way I'm going to orientate it. So once I've got those 4 pieces and I've got my pattern showing here on the ends, I'll number them as you can see here, and then basically I'll tack weld all of this together. Tack weld all of this together, and then weld it. Once I've got that bar and I'm happy with the weld, what I'll do then is I make tiles. There's a couple of different ways that you can do it. I like to make tiles, and I'll explain that to you. So here on my board again, I'm going to just write from here back up to the top. So I put my bar into a 4-way. Yep. That gives me a square bar into a square. What I'm going to do then is I've got my bar. Here's my big bar of pattern welded steel. And as I said, there's a couple of different ways that you can actually stretch that out, because you've got to keep in mind that the pattern that we've got is only on the ends of the bar. It's not along the length of the bar, but I have to make it along the length of the bar. So how do I do that? A couple of ways, as I've just said. One of the first ways is what's known as an accordion fold. So these little triangular pieces here get removed. Yep. So you cut them out. I cut them out usually on my bandsaw, or you could use an angle grinder, with a 1mm disc. So basically what you end up with is a piece of steel that looks like this. So what I'm actually doing by cutting this area out is that I'm revealing the face of my pattern along the length of the bar, because I'm going to compress this. Well, what happens here is on these hinges, that actually changes the pattern. It's quite sort of random with what you actually get. The other thing is that you've got to be very careful when you start flattening this out, that you could get a tear in your steel, because you're actually exerting a hell of a lot of pressure to get this into a flat bar. So that's called the accordion fold or accordion cut. I don't throw away these pieces, by the way. I'll hang on to them. We'll make some other stuff with that later on. What I like to do is I'll get my bar, and what I'll do is I'll cut this on an angle, usually about 30 degrees, 35 degrees. Yep. So along here, once I've cut that tile, I lay it out on my bench. So this face here and here becomes my weld joint. Yep. So it looks like this. So this is this face here I'm talking about. What I'll do is I'll tack that all together. Hang on, that might make it a little bit more noticeable. Yep. So I'll tack these. This is the edge here. So I've got pattern appearing along the face of my block of steel now. So I'll just MIG weld these all together, both sides. And then what I'll do is I'll come along here with my TIG welder, and I'll just TIG all of this so that it's all shut, so that there's no oxygen or any gaps getting into my bar of steel. Once I've got all of that, it's back into the fire, get it up to its critical temperature, and bang. And hopefully everything's gone okay, and now I've got a full length of steel, and so then I can go and make my knife from there. I don't know whether we'll be able to see this, but here's one I prepared earlier. So again, basically it really depends on how you stack your bar up in the beginning stages. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be alternate. So it's just one more manipulation and you've got yourself a totally different pattern altogether. And that's the reason why I put this up on the board. Because sometimes it might take me a couple of days to actually make a bar of steel. And so if I forget where I'm up to, I don't know what my next move is going to be. So I can have a look on my board and I go, right, that's where I'm up to. What's my next step? So again, I'm planning everything out. What I do is when I'm experimenting with some mosaic patterns, I've got a concept in mind of what I think it's going to look like, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. As I've just said, you know, one more manipulation and you've got yourself a totally different pattern. You know, I've made some mosaics in the past, and I sort of didn't really turn out the way that I had expected it, but it was like, oh, hey, that's pretty cool. I like that. So what I do is I'll take a photo of this. Then I can have it in my computer. So I'm able to replicate that pattern again. Because it doesn't take very much just to, you know, again, it's only one more manipulation and you've got yourself a different pattern. So make sure that you make a note of how you're setting your billet up in the first place and just go from there.